With us today are Dr. Jennifer Turner, who is the director of the China Environment Forum at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and my fellow Michigander, Keith Schneider, who's the senior editor and chief correspondent of the Circle of Blue organization. Their impressive bios are in your program, so let me explain just a bit about their project that they will talk about today. The conflicting demand for water, food, and energy is one of the challenges of the 21st century. The Wilson Center and the Circle of Blue have partnered in a collaboration called, by a wonderfully descriptive name, Global Choke Point, to address this triple threat of food, energy, and water security. So today, they will explore with us several global choke points around the world. And they'll help us understand the peril, but also the promise. So please help me welcome Dr. Turner and Mr. Schneider to our conference. Thank you.
Thanks for the intro, Dixie. I actually grew up outside Chicago, so I am a Midwesterner too. I had some bona fide qualifications here. Hi, welcome. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about our Global Choke Point project. As Dixie mentioned about Circle of Blue, I mean, they are a news and science organization that produces really super compelling, I'm bragging for you here, so look good, okay? They're really compelling multimedia reports on water. Now, I work at the Wilson Center. I've been there 15 years, and I head the global mafia on energy and environmental issues in China, right? You guys know Wilson Center, a lot of you. We bring people together, we have meetings, I do a lot of exchanges, and my goal is I serve the practitioners around the world, business, government, NGO researchers, to help you find out what's going on in China and, you know, just promote dialogue and stuff. And so I'm a water person, and while working at the Wilson Center, I had to do a lot on energy. And over the years, I started thinking, why isn't no one in my big mafia around the world is looking at water and energy issues in China? Well, and I was thinking, well, how do we do this? And Keith will give you more details in a minute, but Keith and his gang at Circle of Blue, they produced a report called Choke Point US that looked at how energy development was impacting water in the world, in the US. And I was so impressed by this that I called them up and said, hey, we could do this in China. And Keith, he's a really open guy. I said, I'm sending you to China. We got a grant, of course, sent him to China. And we produced over 25 more multimedia reports. We've put on, I've helped, I woke you up now, right? I've put out multiple meetings in China and the US, but reaching out to Chinese government, NGO business, and researchers. And we're starting to change policy and thinking in China vis-a-vis water. So I'm going to tell you a story today, okay? Right? You got movies before, but now we got live storytelling. And so when we're starting to talk about China and the environment, a lot of you immediately think of pollution issues, right? Last March, Li Keqiang, the vice premier, said, we have a war on pollution, focusing on air pollution. And air pollution is bad in China, right? There's smog all over this. Who's been to China in a glorious smog? Yeah, it's like, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's no joking matter. I mean, 1.2 million people die early every year from the air pollution issues. We know, because of most of their energy comes from coal, 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. To most people, you think air is China's biggest problem. But, wait a minute. My thing, hold on a minute. It is skipping slides. Why is it doing that? Okay, sorry. Do I have an expert here that why it's going to be? Okay, start again. That kind of threw me off there. Maybe it keeps me live and smart. Okay, but while air pollution is bad in China, water is their biggest burden. First of all, just in terms of shortage, they've got about 1/3 per capita of the water resources of the rest of the world, and you guys know that China has a lot of people. But in northern China, which only gets about 20% of their rainfall, it's down to 1/10 per capita. It used to be an issue of floods were a big concern in China, and droughts are growing ever more severe. There's also the problem of water quality. China's probably the only country in the world that I know of that has their own term of water pollution-induced scarcity. So you have a lot of water shortages in China, and you have a lot of water that you really don't want to touch. By Chinese standards, the lowest 3 levels of water quality would 35% of their water is in those lower 3 categories, which means it shouldn't even come in contact with human beings. But we know it is. And we know that when we did some reporting, one of Nadia, we sent her out there to look at water quality issues, and lo and behold, a lot of farmers are forced to irrigate with industrial waste water. And so it's no surprise to me when you start hearing stories that maybe 20% of China's rice is contaminated with cadmium, right? The water quality issue is a severe problem in China. But we went to China not asking about specifically shortages or quality. It came into our storytelling. But I sent Keith to China with a bunch of other folks, where they spent initially a month in China, trooping around December 2010, asking one question. And one question leads to other. But the basic question was, how is energy development impacting water? I sent Keith to the Ministry of Water Resources, all the top energy researchers in China, NGOs, business people. And he asked that question, and I think, Keith, everyone said, 不知道. And through the interpreter, that was, they don't know, Keith. But Keith is such a charming guy. For some reason, and I've discovered this in India as well, people give this man data, right? And they tell him stories. And one of the stories that we came up with was revolved around where this man is standing. Where's this man standing? Come on, throw it. He's in a tunnel. Not a sewer. There's actually, it's in China. Where's the smart aleck back there? Yes, it is in China. It is a tube. It is actually the world's largest water transfer project. Water is on the move in China. Remember North China, only 20% of the rainfall? Southern China has more water. Mao Zedong said years ago, we can move this. And you know Chinese engineers, right? They have a very special tattoo. It says nothing's too big. And they are moving this water. Let's see how that looks. They have already completed the eastern line. The central line, I think, comes online this month. As in now, right? They just flicked the switch the other day. This week, whew, hurrah. Now, we interviewed the engineer of the South-North Water Transfer Project and asked him, said, okay, we get the first 2 lines, but this western line, you're going to have to blast through mountains, and it's going to take millions and millions, billions of dollars, and a lot of time. And he said, we must do it. Why did he say we must do it? He said, we got to get the coal up in northwest China, because coal is what powers the economy, right? So this is kind of our anchor story for China, is that water serves energy. It's a story that's true around the world. Keith will tell you more of those, but we're focused on China now. Now, in pulling the numbers together, we have calculated, looking at the supply chain of coal in China, that it's using 20% of the water. And we went back to China, and all the people who before said, 不知道, said, whoa, really? That seems like a lot. And no one, and who knows? We're just the foreigners who came in and got the numbers. But we've started raising a lot of interest in China about coal's water footprint. Now, they use a lot of coal, but they've also been expanding faster than any country in the world of clean energy technologies, which was talked a lot about in that last panel, right? They're more water sipping. They don't use as much water. So you've got China, they're breaking records last year of installing 12 gigawatts of new solar panels. That's more than us. They're doing 13 or 14 gigawatts this year. They're going to do 14 the year after that, and it just keeps going on. Wind, #1 installed wind in the world. They had a lot of problems hooking it up the grid for a while, but they've gone past those problems. They've got a lot of wind online. Also doing massive amounts on energy efficiency, which was raised in the last panel as well. Lots of saving, very aggressive policies and campaigns to really push their industries to become more energy efficient. But when you look at the nice pie charts, and my apologies, it's a pie chart, and pie charts are boring, but these are important pie charts. When you look at the electricity mix in China, 2010, 70% of the electricity came from coal. Between 2000 and 2007, their coal use doubled. It doubled again since then. It's doubling again by 2020. So the pie is getting bigger, and coal is still dominating. In fact, I go as far as saying coal is king in China. And what we've done in Choke Point, in gathering data, pulling information together, is that we say that coal is thirsty. This king is thirsty. And Keith can run down all the numbers in a very scary, fast fashion for you. But the simple answer about what coal's impact on water is that as coal is increasing, there's just, in northern China in particular, there's not enough water to meet those demands. And But that's not stopping their planning. China does not have chicken pox here. These dots are actually plans, some of them already in action now. Giant coal bases. We took a coal safari last year with a group of US and Chinese water energy experts. Miles and miles and miles of coal mines, coal to liquids, coal to chemicals, coal-fired power plants. Huge scale infrastructure that blows your mind. And a lot of it is in Inner Mongolia. Inner Mongolia mines as much coal as the entire United States, providing 26% of China's production, but it only has 1.5% of their water. Whew. What you gonna do? Well, one of the ideas, besides waiting for south-north water transfer water, is there's talk, and Keith uncovered this story, about using nuke and coal power to desalinate water, to pump that water to Inner Mongolia and use that to help you mine coal. Energy to make water, to make more energy. And if that works, we're going out to Xinjiang. And, but this is Inner Mongolia, to show you, though, that the impact of coal mining, because it's taken a lot of water. It's one of the women that another Circle of Bloom team member hung out with for a while. And this used to be relatively lush grasslands, right? There's nomads. There's also a lot of farming in north-central China. And one of my favorite stories, I don't know if I ever told Keith. Keith, I told this is one of my favorite stories of yours, this little fact you found out, is that we know that about 50% of China's corn and wheat is raised in north-central China, in the grasslands. And when we were talking, finding out that, well, the ag in this area has tried to become much more efficient, but it's just the pressures to mine coal are so big, they need that water. And so Keith asked the Ministerial Resources folks, what are you gonna do? And again, remember, this is China. They said, not a problem. We are moving the grain belt. And so I love China. It's like there's nothing small there. And Keith was so entranced with this that the second time I sent him back to China, he keeps saying yes to China. It's good. And you went up to this area, and he found out, well, what are they doing? Massive investments into irrigation. A lot of the US companies, Caterpillar and all these guys that make big farming equipment, very happy. They're starting to build like big farming stuff like we know in the Midwest. But there could be some interesting impacts of that you rebuild a grain belt. I've talked about coal, but let's talk about the queen briefly. Hydropower, big source of electricity in China. In fact, the Chinese government in the most recent 5-year plan, which ends next year actually, but they've put hydropower back in the front seat, saying that this is good for reducing CO2 emissions. And so right now, 150 gigawatts, maybe 170 actually, come from hydro now. They want to ramp that up to 400 gigawatts by 2020. And they're doing that by building these, it's interactive on my website, but lots of these little dots are existing, planned, and under construction dams, hydropower dams in southwest China. Now, the only problem is that for the past 4.5 years, southwest China has been undergoing a severe drought. And it was at its peak when Keith and everyone went back in 2010. And so it was so a lot of all these dams that are existing, the water level was really low. And I know you're starting to get worried here. They're going to build all these dams, but don't you worry. You know how in shampoo where it says 25% more free, right? Well, in China, when you build a hydropower plant, you also build a coal-fired power plant. Right? It comes with it. Because they have to keep the electricity moving to ship it out to the East Coast. Now, in the same part of the country, in the Southwest, China is also doing exploration of shale gas. Not the revolution, that was talked about a lot but in the last panel, but there's a lot of hope for shale. In the interim, they're importing massive amounts of natural gas from Australia, from the Stans, just signed a huge deal with the Russians, because they're really seeing their future. Well, China's energy portfolio is everything, but they are seeing natural gas as an important way to reduce the air pollution, which they are literally choking on. And just to show you that, to support all this, moving this sometimes very, water impacting energy, they've built these giant electricity transfer corridors in China, taking the electricity to the East Coast, which consumes 40% of the electricity. And I have this slide up here also just to kind of make us remember that even we here, we are linked to this. 25% of the electricity produced in China goes for products for export. So, we're kind of intertwined in some of the choke points happening in China. So, what can the Chinese do to address their choke points? I mean, there's one obvious one, and they're also thinking about this too, and moving forward in terms of lowering air pollution, is just reduce GDP growth, right? China's GDP has grown 10% every year for the past 40-some years. Let's take a moment and ponder how lovely that would be. All right. But that's difficult to do because the Chinese government and the Communist Party, their legitimacy is based on economic growth. They got to keep it going, and to keep it going, you need coal. So if you're having difficulty getting at coal, and maybe it's costly to move the water, or not necessarily that costly because water is pretty cheap, you could be importing more coal, which they have been over the last few years, but now they're starting to think about doing less of that. Some of that comes from the air pollution problem, and also it's rather expensive. Wyoming and Montana are getting very sad. They think about that. But it's really Australia, which he also did reporting on in Australia, looking at how Australia is exporting a lot of coal and natural gas to China, which is having choke point impacts in that country. Import more grain, shifting harvests I mentioned, and China is importing lots more grain because that is embedded water, right? Virtual water imports. It's an issue that a lot of countries we don't look at, right? You know, what's our water footprint of our trade? Well, it's big, it's growing in China. And the other thing is that they want to push for less coal and also cleaner coal. On the left here, it's a coal cap. In September, a Chinese leader at the UN summit, climate summit, talked about how China is looking seriously at capping their coal consumption, which is a pretty amazing declaration from a country that is mainly dependent on coal. But the problems from the air pollution, and now, as we've been talking to them, water issues, are pushing them to go in this direction. On the right, this is also from our reporting that's inside an ultra supercritical coal-fired power plant. It was so funny when I sent these guys to China. You guys came back mainly with pictures of infrastructure, because guys like infrastructure. Second time I made them take pictures of people. But this thing is 40% more efficient with burning the coal, and that reduces the water footprint, which is all good news. To wrap up, so I'm being quick because you want to hear his stories, because you want to go global beyond China. But, and it's not very Chinese to brag, but I have to brag a little bit because in my partnership with Circle Blue has catalyzed this really exciting multimedia reporting, which then has enabled me to put on lots and lots of meetings. I know meetings sound boring, but we don't do boring meetings. But we've gone and we've talked to big and small groups around China. We tell them this story, but we also tell them about US choke points, India choke points, that it's a global phenomena, the water, energy, food confrontations, and about getting people talking about what they can do. And what's been exciting is that the 12th five-year plan for energy development in China raises the issue of coal-water linkages. The Ministry of Water Resources, when we took our group of US and Chinese experts around Beijing, one of them was from the Ministry of Water Resources, and he thanked me. He said, yeah, we're starting to regulate allocations to the coal sector now. I'm like, woohoo! Greenpeace China, because of our reporting, they've now have a project called Thirsty Coal, in which they've been doing kind of basically reaffirming our work, but doing it further lower down on the ground. And there's also been the World Bank. They've started an initiative in China working with the energy ministry there called Thirsty Energy, and they said that we really helped tee them up to do this kind of work. And Natural Resources Defense Council has a coal cap project, and because I just wouldn't stop talking about water, they've actually integrated a water component to their work, realizing that you can't just look at coal because of the air pollution or the CO2 emissions. And that because when you bring the calculation of water in, it often will raise the cost of coal. So, so for the people that are, I don't want to say, are anti-coal, maybe it gives them another tool in their tool chest. But that said, every form of energy has some impact on water, and water is inherently local. And so we're trying to help promote the awareness in China that, that in making these decisions, they need to look at, what is the local water resources. And the last thing I'll say, before I hand it over to Keith, is that I have two things to say, and then it's yours, all right? Another kind of impact, and again, I say this because it's very exciting for me to see that people took our reporting and our constant talking and are turning it into action. The US DOE, Secretary Moniz he personally is really interested in water energy nexus issues in the United States. And DOE that came to me and to Keith, and now they're taking it more to their international work, and they proposed it to APEC, which China's leading this year, and they are having basically, I call it they're starting choke point work, and that makes me happy. I'm actually starting a new project working with a Chinese city in Shenzhen and Oakland, California, doing water. We're going to be doing water energy footprints, bringing more people together. A lot of them, business community people, and so yeah. So it's been a fun ride, but China wasn't enough. And so now I've actually, at the Wilson Center, I've convinced my colleagues in the Asia program and other projects to also work with Circle of Blue. And then I said, Keith, we're sending you to India. And he said, yes. And so, but he's gone to other places too. So this is me talking about China. And now Keith is going to regale you with other stories. You ready, Keith? I got your PowerPoint all set.
Great.
And you can ask questions at the end. We're going to be ping pong.
All right.
They're awake.
Good.
Don't change that.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Circle of Blue is a newsroom of the future, and one of the facets of a newsroom of the future is that you can collaborate. We collaborate, and having Jennifer as a collaborator has just been great. We've done this talk on how many continents now? My part of this is to take us through to India, but before I do that, I want to give us some grounding on why the choke point between energy, water, and food in the era of climate change is upon us and is occurring as we talk. All right, we're 75% of us are water, and 75% of the earth is water, so we are the earth is us, and this is why we have such affinity to water. Agriculture is the largest user of water on the planet. Depending upon the country where you are, 75%, 80% of the water on the planet, fresh water on the planet, is used in agriculture, and here's why. You can see at this chart how much water it takes. To have a liter of milk takes 1,000 liters of water, and it takes that much water not only because of the processing, because of the grain that goes into the feeding of the cow, and the water that's needed to keep the cow healthy, also bread and rice. Energy is the second largest user of water. About 15 to 20% of the water on the planet, depending upon the country. Half of the water withdrawals in the United States are for energy, for cooling power plants, thermal power plants. Here's why. Most of the energy, electrical energy, in the United States is coal and nuclear, the same globally. Nuclear is the largest user of water. Coal is the second largest user of water. Wind and solar, very small users of water. Solar, for instance, a user of water in cleaning the photovoltaic plants. This does not encompass the centralized mirror-type power plants that have to be cooled. All right. We're growing 80 million people a year. And over the next generation, we're going to be using 50% more water globally. In the developed countries, lesser. In fact, the USGS just published its latest assessment of water use in the United States, and we're dropping, actually, along with our energy use. All right. I've kind of described the confrontation between water, energy, food in scientific terms that I think work. And it's a confrontation between the maximum power principle and the law of minimum growth. The maximum power principle was developed in the 19th century, the law of minimum growth in the 20th century, and here's what they say. Biological systems and economic systems, market systems, will grow as large as you can, unfettered. That's why forests grow, that's why China's developing the way it is, that's why growth is such a big deal in the economic sector. It's why viruses grow. We grow with unlimited, no limits, until we confront the law of minimum growth. And in biological systems, that's the scarcest resource. That's the resource that will limit any more growth. And in economics, what is the resource? Well, globally, what we're finding at Circle of Blue is it's not soil, it's not air, it's not energy, and it's certainly not capital that is the limiting resource for our development in the 21st century. It's water. Water is the minimum growth. And I'm going to take you very quickly before we get to India about how this is working. So we've been to Mexico, Tehuacan, Mexico, major agriculture area that's been suffering from very severe droughts. And we found that as dryness, scarcity afflicts the agricultural economy, jobs are lost, Many, many, many of the young people, particularly the young men, are coming to the United States. So a piece of our immigration problem, our immigration situation on our border, southwest border, has to do with scarcity of water in the farm sectors in Mexico. We were in Australia in 2008 at the end of a serious, severe 12-year drought that crippled their rice industry, the largest rice industry in the southern hemisphere, well over 1 million metric tons. Well, when the rice industry in the southern hemisphere crippled, it also played into food scarcity at that time, which played into the Arab Spring of 2010. So food price rises was a factor in the Arab Spring uprisings in 2010. I was in Mongolia, in Kanbog, where the South Gobi Desert is being developed for energy. There's no water, no surface water in the South Gobi Desert, but there is minerals. So there is a very significant choke point occurring in the South Gobi Desert as Mongolia develops its minerals. It's coal and it's copper and it's gold. This is Rio Tinto's mine in the South Gobi Desert. Very, very modern, but is as tipped off a serious political struggle between the herders in that region and the miners. We've been to the Arabian Gulf. This is Doha. This skyline didn't exist a decade ago. So the Arabian Gulf, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia growing very fast on uber westernized scale, using their fossil fuel resources to do this. Well, there is no water in the South Arabian Gulf, in the Arabian Gulf. There's seawater in the Arabian Gulf. There's almost no fresh water, very low groundwater, so tremendous amounts of energy are being used. Oil in Saudi Arabia, natural gas in Doha. Well, there are several now assessments around the world that show, including one in Qatar, that Saudi Arabia, using so much energy, in part to desalinate so much water, ceases to be an oil exporting nation by 2028. Well, if that's true, that's 10 million barrels a day on the world market. Who makes it up? And if we don't make it up, global economic disruption will be severe starting in the early 2020s. And of course, here in the United States, California is now in the grip of the most serious drought that it's had in its history. It's the most serious ecological emergency in the United States since the Dust Bowl. It's dropping, this is Lake Mead, it's dropping Lake Mead to record low levels. Lake Mead is at the lowest level it's been since it was filled, and it's been there for 60 years. So we're seeing in California develop what is the capacity of a modern American democracy to cope with serious ecological emergencies. That's what's happening in California right now. All right, and then where I live in the Great Lakes region, got plenty of water, but because of changing farm practices, because of the inability of both states and the federal government to regulate the farm sector and its new cultivation practices, particularly around soybeans, there's a lot of phosphorus going into Lake Erie. We solved this problem 40 years ago. It's back this summer. You may have heard poisoned algae shut down the intake valves of Toledo.
Okay. I got to interject. China's importing the soybeans.
China's importing 60% of the world's soybeans, which is another story. All right, let me take it. So you understand sort of how this is now happening around the world. So I'm going to take it to India. And my story in India starts in 2003 when the Prime Minister Vajpayee declared in kind of a moonshot announcement that he was going to develop India was going to develop 162 dams to generate 50,000 megawatts of power in order to diversify India's power sector, because India needs more electricity to be what at the time and still is their chief goal, which is to mimic Western development patterns in the United States and China, okay? 50,000 of them. And 40,000 of those megawatts, 113 of those dams was going to come from places like this, was going to come from the Himalayas, way up in the Himalayas. So the south side of the Himalaya range is the wet side. It's where the water flows. It's the source of many of the rivers that are flowing through India, okay? This also happens to be the most dynamic landscape in the world. Lots of earthquakes, lots of landslides, lots of floods. People get killed there. It's a very dangerous place to be. All right, so 33 of those dams were proposed in Uttarakhand, and Uttarakhand is north of Delhi and it borders Tibet, and it's the middle one up there. All right, so it's a Himalayan state. 33 of the 162 dams were going to be proposed in Uttarakhand, and it was going to be done in these very sacred valleys. Four of Hinduism's most sacred temples are in this region. One of them is this one, Kedarnath. Kedarnath lies beneath these snow peaks way up on the Mandakini River at 14,000 feet. I mean, it's way up there. You can't get there half the year because it's snowed in. All right, and this is what it looks like. And I went there in December of 2013, almost a year ago, and I'll be back there next week to follow up on the aftermath. But Kedarnath had a flood. Here's what those valleys look like. But Kedarnath had a flood in 2013. June 16th and 17th, a cloudburst laid a foot of rain on those snow peaks, and it burst an alpine lake up there, and that water came down that valley, and it just took out Kedarnath, and it took out dozens of these villages that lay in those valleys. This was a green valley. You can see the little town right there. This is 20 kilometers downstream from Kedarnath, and that valley is now filled with rubble. And this is what it looks, Sonparag, this is what's left of this town, all right? So this is December, this is 5 weeks after the flood. Took out 85 bridges. You can see how high this bridge is and how high that water got. 9,000 kilometers of roads damaged. I drove on these roads to get to these places. Very serious damage to buildings, hundreds and hundreds of buildings. I was interested in what was the effect on the hydroelectric sector. By the way, India says that 6,000 people died in this flood. The scientists and the villagers in this region said 30,000 people died in this flood. We heard almost nothing about this flood in the United States. This is a climate change flood. It was said so by the American Meteorological Society in September. It was one of 14 disasters that were related to climate change last year. I was interested in the hydroelectric sector. Remember, this was the south side, the west side of the Himalayas was where India wants to diversify its power sector. Well, this is what we found. This was a dam at Okund on the Mandakini, was just taken out, all right? This was Vishnuprag during the flood. This is what it looks like after the flood. This was supposed to be a lake. This was where they draw the water from to gain the hydropower. It's now a lake of rubble. This is how big that dam was, all right? This is 6 months after, and the owner of the dam is digging out this dam. Dams are washed away completely. So this is a dam that was in Fatah, is no longer in Fatah. And this is the power station at the Srinagar Dam, the newest dam in this region, which was inundated by these floodwaters, and the grit and the mud got into the gearing and all of the turbines in this blue building and took out this dam. And in the last 3 months, the upstream, where you see the concrete upstream of that, the walls collapsed in the water race from the river. All right, this is some of the damage. So if we go through this quickly, and I'm going through this quickly, we had 33 of those 162 were proposed, 5 have been commissioned, less than a third of the hydropower that was supposed to be in place by now is in place. 5 dams are under construction, 24 more proposed. And now India, between 2003 and now, had proposed 130 more dams, most of them in the Himalayas. All right. But they're not going to be able to get to that. They're not going to be able to get to it. And the reason is that the Himalayas are not going to let India do that kind of development. It's too dangerous. The climate change has changed the meteorological cycles, and India is not nearly close to developing the hydropower sector that it envisioned. All right, so they're growing about 1,000 megawatts a year, 1 gig a year in hydropower. They're at 40. To get to 150 at 1 gig a year will take a century at the current pace. So India's hydropower dreams have confronted the law of maximum power principle, meeting the law of minimum growth. And that is, the law of minimum growth is that the Himalayas are just not going to let them do it. All right, well that's just not happening in the Himalayas. India's power generating supply is growing about 10 to 14,000 megawatts a year, about 10 to 14 gigs a year. And right now, the utility sector produces 237 gigs, 237,000 megawatts. That's 1/5, a little bit over 1/5 what we produce in the United States. It's less than 1/5 of what China produces. It seems like a lot of energy, but for a nation of nearly 1.3 billion people, it's not a lot of energy. And you can see that in this chart. You can see that we use, per capita, 13,000 kilowatts a year. You know, India uses 684 kilowatts a year. That's about what you guys, many in this room, use in a month, 684 kilowatts. All right, so what's keeping India from developing the energy, particularly the electrical energy it needs to be a Western power? And the impediments in India are profound. They're not only environmental, as we've seen in the Himalayas. It has to do with population. So I said there are 80 million people more a year in the world. Well, 25 million of them come from India. There's just tremendous amount of people. Who's been to India? So, you know, you go to India, the place swarms everywhere, right? Swarms. Everywhere you go, there's a swarm. You come back to the US, and you're like, where is everybody?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? You get off the plane, and you get on the thing, you're like, where is everybody? Well, India's not like that. All right. Tremendous, suffocating bureaucracy. So this is an active office in the water irrigation department in Punjab, picture taken a year ago, in which India actually does its transactions by paper. And so you can see the little guy in the back in the turban, in the red turban. I mean, he's really moving paper. So if you interview, so when you go through India as a journalist, and remember that we, at Circle of the Blue, we're seeing the world from a perspective that most people don't see it. You know, when you talk about water, energy, and food, you are in the guts of every country on earth, because that's what civilization is how we deal with water, energy, and food. And so when you interview an Indian official at the state level and at the federal level, basically you talk to that person, they're generally men, and they're busy as they're talking to you signing papers that their aides, their flock of aides, continue to bring them, after, so that's all they do all day long is open up these folders, go through it, and sign papers. It's remarkable. Corruption in India. From the time an Indian is born to the time they die, up and down the system, there is a visible economy, and then there is an invisible economy, and it's called chai pani, tea and water. And you have to, in India, in order to conduct your affairs, both personal and professional, there is tea and water. There is a little payoff, and as you go up the system, it gets more profound. So there is this enormous corruption occurring in India's system that prevents it from really acting in any kind of a fair way in the kinds of decisions that it has to make about energy, water, and food. 1/3 of the power in India, electrical power, is lost or stolen. So the transmission systems there are just tremendously old and inefficient, and then lots of power is lost. So that 237,000 gigawatts that the utilities are producing, less than 150 basically is reaching the end of the line. So what does that mean? Brownouts and blackouts are endemic to the country. And if brownouts and blackouts are endemic to your country, it's very difficult to run any kind of businesses. It also is produced a proliferation of diesel power generators to make up for the loss, which is raising India's imports, oil imports in the diesel sector. Okay. And then India has this policy of using their natural resources as social welfare policy. So if you farm grain in India, and most of India's agriculture is related in one way to rice, corn, other grains, pulses, you get free water. And 700 million of India's nearly 1.3 billion people are connected to agriculture. So you're getting free power and free water. So you're producing these endemic surpluses. So when we were there in 2012, 62 million metric tons of rice was being stored outdoors under rubber and rotting because it isn't reaching the market. That's 60%. That year was 60% of their grains. It's using 19% of the country's electricity, too.
Crazy.
So a function of the brownouts and the blackouts and the inability to move electricity around is the fact that India has this policy, right? Uses a lot of water, and it uses a lot of water because India's electricity is being used in its grain-growing regions for lots of pumps. So there are 20 million electric water pumps going on, being pumped all the time. So groundwater levels are draining, which means more powerful pumps, which means deeper wells, right? And there are 20,000 pumps being added just to the pumping in Punjab alone. So this is a cycle of grievous harm and risk, ecological and economic in India. All right, and you can see that these impediments are slowing India's economic development. So our conclusion at Circle of Blue is that India has no chance over the next 70, 80 years to even get close to a Western-style economy, because the law, maximum power principle met the law of minimum growth in India in so many ways. And so, the media, particularly my colleagues at the New York Times, my former colleagues at the New York Times, were very fond for a while of saying India is going to be the next great power, new China. Well, I think that was because my former colleagues went to one building on one modern street corner in Bangalore and declared India was going to be the next power. Well, they didn't go to the rest of the country, which is where we were, where it's not going to be the rest power. And its growth patterns are going to continue to slow because of these confrontations. Nevertheless, it's going to try. So we just had a new election in India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi got elected. He's a pro-growth prime minister who's now promised, to try to raise those power principles and try to raise that economy. And so India's going after coal big time, big time. This is what you see in India. Tremendous production in coal, 558 million metric tons. It's the third largest coal producer in the world. It's growing by 20 million metric tons a year. That's 1/5 of China's growth in coal production. Ours, by the way, is declining. But demand is rising much faster, so it has to import tremendous amounts of coal. So that's another drain, another impediment on India's development. It has to import more of its coal in order to attain this Western economic level that they're not going to be able to attain. It is so desperate for coal in India. I went to a place in northeast India between Bangladesh and Burma called Meghalaya. And Meghalaya produces 5 million metric tons of coal a year. And it produces it all by hand in places like this. This is a box mine in Meghalaya. In order to get to, there are hundreds of these. And they're about 30 square meters, and they're anywhere from 20 to 50 meters deep, 60 to 100 feet deep. And in order to get to the bottom of it, these guys have to walk down these steps. I didn't go down those steps. This is what the towns look like. All of this is done by hand. All the mining is done by hand. All the loading of the coal is done by hand, and the coal is used in the cement, chemicals, power sector in neighboring Assam. And this is what the mines look like at the bottom of the box mine. It's called a rat hole mine, and it's literally the men who mine this are about the size of an American 7th grader. And they mine it in these carts, and here's one of those miners, and there's the cart, and it takes, where this picture was taken in Meghalaya, it's 1 kilometer to get to the coal face. So these guys are walking down, they literally walk down that narrow tunnel, that rat hole, an hour to get to the coal face. It takes them an hour to fill this cart. It takes them an hour to drag it out. They can do that 2 or 3 times a day. The cart's worth about $2 or $3. They split it. So these guys are working their tails off for less than $5 a day. And I asked them about that, and they said, look, it's a job. We need the job. All right. But it produces massive, massive pollution. So this is acid mine trench, turns the Luka River blue because of the chemistry of this river and the chemistry of the pollution coming into it. This river gets blue, and what it is it's sulfate. It's an actual tofu-looking substance that clings to the bottom of this river that reflects off the sky and turns this unnatural Gatorade looking blue. All right. India's trying clean energy. You know, they're doing okay. They're doing okay. 24,000 megawatts of solar is 2,200, wind is 20. And they're doing all right. The problem with it is that it's tough to hook it up to the transmission line. You know, the transmission lines are not modern enough, and the periodicity of the electricity is tough enough. So even, you know, the smart engineers in India can't get it done. They're trying biomass. We met a farmer. There's a bit of biomass being done, mostly through rice hulls, but also now in this kind of elephant grass. A little bit is being tried, and Indian entrepreneurs are trying it. But the problem, here's the central problem. If you look at the US and China, the US produced 35 gigawatts, sorry, 35 quadrillion BTUs. So a BTU is a unit of energy, and a quadrillion BTU is a lot of energy. And in 1950, we produced and consumed 35 quadrillion BTUs. And you can see by 2027, 57 years later, we got to 100. China produced comparable levels of what we did in 1950 in 1995, at 33. They got to 100 in 2010. So they did in 15 years what it took us 57 years to do. And as Jennifer was explaining, that coal production, which is now coal use, consumption in China is 3.6 billion metric tons a year and going up 100 million metric tons a year. China is using that coal to double it again. China wants to double its energy consumption and production again by 2035. But you look at India. India's at 11 in 1995. Took them 10 years to get, you know, 5 more quadrillion BTUs. They're at about 25 now. They're growing about 1 quadrillion BTUs a year. And by 2035, they'll be almost 50. All right? Just to get to a US production and consumption, which is, by the way, declining a little bit because we're more efficient, it's going to take them 50 years minimum. 50 years minimum. In a country that's going to be by 2035, 1.5 billion people. 1.5 billion people by then. So in order to get to a comparable Western energy production level, they're going to need to be at 200 quads or more. So it's easy for me to, as a journalist, got no skin in this game other than, you know, just looking at the facts. It's easy to look at this and say, not going to get there. India isn't going to be that great big power. India isn't going to solve its brownouts and its blackout problems anytime quickly. India is ambitious. It's got lots of goals, but its democracy, its bureaucracy, and its impediments are so powerful. So what does India do with this knowledge, which they're going to come to? Well, you know, China built Shanghai with what it's doing. Anybody been to Shanghai? You know, tremendously impressive place, tremendously polluted place. When they figure out how to fix all that, they're going to realize what a beautiful city they have. But that's what they did. They built Beijing and Shanghai and Chengdu and, you know, 10,000-kilometer rail system and brought 400 or 500 million people from poverty to the middle class, right? Well, India's a different place. India's a much different place. It moves at a different pace. It's much more rural. 400 million Indians don't have electricity. It's villages.
Got to wrap it up.
Right? It is this gorgeous, gorgeous place. This is a waterfall in Meghalaya where there are 2,000 elephants in these forests. It has these, you know, active Himalayan towns. You know, Jaipur is this magnificent city in the desert. So India is a different place. So the new India, what is the new India going to be? Well, that's what they need to figure out in the 21st century as they confront energy, water, and food impediments. So that's my India story.
Thanks. I didn't know if you had that extra stuff on there. Okay, he was waving at me. So, okay. Do you think?
Just a few questions.
Yeah.
Another Michigander, I think.
Yeah. In fact, I live in Traverse City, which I get to enjoy
We're in the hood together.
the 20% of the
freshwater in the Great Lakes. And yes, we are so proud to have Circle of Blue right there. And I would like to return to the broader issue of water shortage. And can you address whether you see the political systems, how they are recognizing this and grappling with this? Who is going to allocate water? Who owns the water? And, you know, is Traverse City going to become the next Saudi Arabia? I mean, you know, what is happening? Who, even in America, who owns the Great Lakes, and what responsibility do we have to share that water with California and all these drought-stricken areas? I think there's tremendous political implications from this.
There's a lot of questions in there.
There's a lot.
There's
Pick
a
one
lot,
you like.
Let's try to make this quickly. Around the world, water is one of those water scarcity and supply actually is driving nations to act on big issues. There aren't very many big issues that the world has decided to act on, but water is one of them. You know, Palestine, Jordan, and Israel are working out some water compacts very quietly because the political system wants this to be a hubbub and everybody angry, but in the workings of water, they've figured out how to deal with it. As we're seeing in California, Jerry Brown is going to be, if he's not already, the most important water manager in the world. You know, Pakistan and India have been dealing with transboundary issues. China and Southeast Asia have been dealing with transboundary issues. My big piece about this is I don't think we're going to have water wars. I think that's a media fabrication. Yeah. I think that the costs are so much easier by diplomatically working this out, and the costs of losing a water war are so high. I mean, what do you do to protect your water supply? You know, how many armies can you have to safeguard? So I don't think we're having water wars, and I think diplomacy is working in many ways around water. We have compacts in the U.S. In terms of the Great Lakes and the water supply. What I'm finding in my work in the United States is that the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley, much of that region was our Rust Belt, was an economic sacrifice zone for 40 years, and Detroit still is in that piece, but Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Owensboro, Kentucky, Louisville, Henderson, Kentucky, are in really good shape for lots of reasons, and certainly climate change could be a net boost economically, of course, net loss ecologically. But yeah, I mean, you know, if you have great-grandchildren, you know, invest in Traverse City because we're going to be growing palm trees there in 100 years, the way this is going.
With water shortage, because again, I skimmed over the top of a lot of big issues. I mean, in China, water's underpriced. I mean, it's all, you know, owned by the state. But you know, even they've seen that they need to, you know, they've been raising the prices, but they're also really trying to push industry to recycle more water now. But that's kind of messy. Again, you remember the South-North Water Transfer Project. They like to build stuff. But even that, one thing that we want to do, I want to send you back, Keith, to look into, what is the actual energy footprint of how they're managing their water? Like we know that they had to build 400 wastewater treatment plants along the eastern line of the South-North Water Transfer Project. Because remember all that nasty water you got there? Well, you know, you need energy to clean it up. And that's a calculation they haven't made yet. Because I actually believe that if China really starts dealing with their water pollution issue, and if they continue transferring water and desalinating water, I mean, it's going to be the most energy-intensive sector in China. I think it's already pretty high, and no one's been recognizing that, except I keep going to China and saying, it's energy-intensive, you got to find out what's going on. And so now, catalyzing researchers to start looking into that. But it can be politically sensitive, too. All right, got another question somewhere out there.
Right there.
Oh, hello. My name is Olivia Arena. I'm from the World Affairs Council of Austin and UT Austin. I have a question about infrastructure in urbanizing areas, specifically in Mumbai. So it's commonly known that there are water wars, to use that term, in between local officials and slum dwellers. What can be done and what infrastructural changes need to be made in those rapidly urbanizing areas to accommodate for the populations that are moving into those areas and the water supply shortages?
Well, I mean, it's not just Mumbai, it's many of these rapidly developing Asian cities. And, you know, the fixes in terms of water quality and supply have been around for what, since the Romans, right?
I know.
We do a little bit better on wastewater cleanup, right, in the 20th century, in the 21st. But these cities are not investing in their infrastructure. And India has no chance of making major investments in its infrastructure. One, because it's socially just not there, culturally not there. People are arriving at a rate that they're having trouble dealing with. And two, economically they can't support it. But we were just in Peru in June looking at water and mining. And Lima, Peru's a wealthy country. I mean, it's got $60 billion plus in export earnings from its minerals sector. And Lima is a really nice city, but more than half of Lima residents have no water, have no running water. And I kept, and they're very nice neighborhoods, and they live, the water trucks is a big deal in Lima and so much of the world. And we were interviewing the city officials about this. How do you want to be a world capital when half your population has no running water? I mean, it's just like pipes and pumps, and they got they have enough water. They can certainly do better on conservation and efficiency. So I don't get it. I don't get it. But in the U.S., just to look at the U.S., I mean, we got $1 trillion in backlog and needs for our own water infrastructure spending and modernization. And cities are doing this on their own. So the federal government has largely abandoned its responsibilities, in my view, to help cities, deal with their water issues the way we used to do this with the interstate highways and with water. I don't see any change in that as the U.S., as the era of indifference to these issues unfolds in the United States. We have this incredible era of indifference on these major issues. So cities are having to do it on their own, and some are doing better than others. New York is doing tremendously well on this issue. Toledo is trying to catch up, and then they're getting hammered with microcystis bacteria. So,
but then in Chinese cities, I mean, local government officials, for years the pressure's been, you gotta get that GDP going, right? And remember, in China, most of you know this, that industries are owned by the local governments. And so the idea that you would, and even that you would mandate, here's my industry, or that I would make you turn on your wastewater treatment plant. But we do have, the municipalities have wastewater treatment plants, and a lot of international support has come in, the Japanese, the World Bank to build. China has got, they are treating their municipal waste. But one little choke point issue that we haven't published this yet, haven't showed you this, that their wastewater treatment plants don't treat the sludge. There's a lot of sludge in China. It's a huge issue. And so what they do is that, no one deals with it well, but so Beijing is ringed with 30 little mountains of sludge. And farmers come and say, "Ooh, yeah, free fertilizer." And so, so it's just, and the reason that they're not treating is that they say they don't even have it installed. They say it's too energy intensive. But again, they're not looking along the whole water. This is a water energy food nexus where they're poisoning their own food supply in the long term with the sludge problem at the scale that it is. So I don't know.
Can I say one more thing about this?
Am I getting depressing? You be cheery. I was depressing.
Thing about this. Orange County, in the last couple of years, has built a state-of-the-art water recycling treatment plant, in which they take sewage from Orange County and they recycle it, and they recharge their aquifers. And they also, from the sludge, generate methane to supply most of the energy needed to run this plant. And it took the officials in Orange County I think they told me, I was in Dubai last year, they said it took them 8 years political work to get this thing built because it was too expensive, it raised their prices, and it was too Then this drought came. And now this plant is now seen as the gold standard in California. What needs to be done from a conservation and a supply, right? Because there's billions of gallons of wastewater flowing through cities out to the Pacific that they could use, which is a really good lesson for us as people, as humanity, which is we have the capacity to solve all these issues.
Yep.
Every single one of them that I talk about, every single one of them. But we don't have the vision. And so we sit and we watch this happen. And in the U.S. we argue about costs, and overseas they don't argue because they know the people there just say, well, it's never going to happen, which is not going to happen. But in fact, if we move on these issues, on dealing with water, in what needs to be done on the planet, we will change the economy, we'll change the world, we'll make things a lot better. And you often have talked about that. Jobs and innovation, technology and trade, and diplomatic breakthroughs and cooperation and collaboration in every way you can think about it. But what I say is that the Earth is pushing us really hard. That's when you've seen this, really hard at this point. So, we can sit here and do nothing. Earth doesn't care. Doesn't care. At some point, and somebody said this in the earlier panel, at some point, hopefully it's not going to be some huge calamity. I mean, drowning 2 cities, 1 major drought in our largest state, 1 major drought in Texas, more deaths than ever before on the Great Plains from tornadoes, microcystis bacteria closing down major cities' water. That's obviously not enough to move us. So that isn't enough, so it has to be even deeper, something deeper than that. God forbid what it's going to be. But once we decide as a country and as a species to deal with this, we're going to do this very fast because we don't have to invent anything. We don't have to invent anything to solve this. We have to invent a new way of collaborating, cooperating, agreeing where we're going. That's the only thing that's missing here.
Well, but also here we are but the choke point lens, water is the core. And I think that when you start evaluating things differently, and again, what's exciting to be positive, because I want to be positive at the end here, is that, in China, they're very pragmatic. And, and they're starting to see that, that looking at the energy sector through the lens of water, it's changing the calculation. And even the issue of waste to energy in China has been so totally not sexy. I'm trying to make it sexy. But I mean, and this California example, I got to go and tell that story in China, because then it really makes the case better for them.
The opposition was like, that's toilet water. We're not going to drink toilet water. Well, they're drinking it now. They love it.
Jennifer, Keith, thank you very much. Like all good panelists, you've given us so much food for thought. We're going to need to plate our lunch for a 4-star, and you know how the Army is when it comes to time. So I'm sure there are more questions out there for you. If you would be so kind as to be perhaps in the foyer to take some of those questions, definitely. And then come back and join us for lunch. But you guys got to move. We're going to set for a half an hour, and Ian Byrne has an announcement for the students.